This is Defender Radio. Defender Radio is brought to you by Gates Wildlife Control and the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals.
It's the week of April 13th, 2015, and this is Michael Howie welcoming you to the YouTube edition of episode 223 of Defender Radio. Before we get started with this week's episode, we need to address a serious situation taking place in Vancouver. Last week, bunker fuel began leaking from a ship in Vancouver's English Bay. Within hours, the toxic fuel had reached the shorelines of popular beaches, prompting warnings to residents to stay away, and activating wildlife oil spill responders. The fur bearers are encouraging anyone who sees wildlife affected by an oil spill to immediately contact one of the expert organizations shown here, and not to approach the wild animals themselves. You can also visit these organizations to learn how you can get trained and volunteer to respond to oil spill scenarios. We like to offer our deepest thanks to those compassionate individuals who are working endlessly to protect wildlife from such horrible situations. On this week's YouTube edition, we've got a clip from our interview with Dr. Sarah Dubois, the Chief Scientific Officer with the BC SPCA. Sarah knows from personal experience that wildlife follows food, and it's in our power to prevent the conflict that arises as a result. She joined Defender Radio to talk the dangers, ethics, and realities of feeding wildlife in our communities. So lately we've been seeing a lot of mixed messaging coming through the media about feeding wildlife. In Ontario, it's been an extremely long and cold winter. In Nova Scotia, it's still the middle of winter somehow. And out west, it's been mild because I hate you all. Now, what is the right solution? I mean, like, why do we normally say don't feed wildlife? What's the baseline reason for that?
The reason for that, of course, is we don't want to habituate these animals or food condition them, especially animals that can pose public safety risks, because unfortunately those animals are often then trapped and killed because of their behaviors. So often people will put out bird feeders for the winter because that's the hardest period of time for some of the birds that are residents to find food, especially if there's a lot of snow on the ground and covering plants. And if it's an unusual winter and food's not coming up quickly in the spring, then that can be problematic. So I think it's really good to consult with your local naturalist groups, but also to understand the bylaws and wildlife laws in your area. We really don't want to cause additional problems and attract rats and other things like that. So it's unfortunate some animals will not make it through the winter. That's just normal in nature, but we don't want animals to suffer either. And so there are some interventions that can take place.
And speaking of interventions, that's, I think, maybe like a two-parter. First, at what point should we be intervening? I remember a discussion with someone a few years ago about a particularly cold winter in eastern Ontario, and the bears were coming out and not finding anything to eat, and it was leading to conflict, and they were saying, well, we should go feed the bears. Meanwhile, across the country, we're telling people never, ever, ever feed bears.
And I would have to agree with that, yeah. Actually, I had a bear in my backyard last week, and unfortunately he got into our local garbage, even though it says mild and there's some food out there. Naturally, he was starting to find compost as in the strata and housing complexes in the neighborhood, and the bear trap was put out, So I don't know if he actually got caught, but we know that that's the reality for bears that are going to be in people's backyards. So we don't encourage feeding them. Again, there have to be, ways for these animals to adapt, and if they aren't going to make it, that's just a factor for natural selection. But sometimes, small animals will be taken in by a rehab center if they're in a starvation phase and euthanized.
To hear more of this interview and learn more about wildlife feeding issues, visit furbeardefenders.com. Until next time, this is Michael Howie reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.